Welcome back, friends, fellow philosophers, and authors, to this Wild Isle writing cast. I have with me fellow dark, evil wizard Nathaniel Cumberledge. How are you, Nathaniel?
Excellent, excellent. Glad to be back.
Yeah, this is going to be a really fun topic, I think. It's going to be a little bit more philosophical than strictly literary, but I think that is for the best. I really want to explore the depths of art versus escapism in terms of literature. Before we begin, I've got some shilling to do. First things first, if you want to be part of this podcast, you can be. Just get in contact with me or someone you know who is in contact with me some way, somehow. I'm all over social media. You could also go to my website, wildislelit.com/contact, and let me know you want to participate. If you don't want to come on the air, but you do want to recommend a topic that isn't already on our list, you can do so. What we have, as of yet, well, at least as of recording, who knows once you see this, we have theme as thesis, symbols, and meta narratives versus motifs. We have setting as world building, discussing what style is and narrative voice is. Also within that is quality prose objectively so. We have one called regression to the mean. So this is a conversation about the rules of writing and when they help you and when they pull you below the wrong half of the bell curve. We have when is a weeb always wrong? A discussion about how anime and manga can harm the novice author. What is the nature of villainy? What makes a villain? Why do people choose evil? One that's going to be close and dear to my heart when I finally get to get around to it. Reader rights versus justified writing. When is the author or reader in the wrong? Because I believe this is a conversation worth having. And one more I added after, let's say, having some discussions over on minds.com. So I have Neo Symposium, Eros in Fiction, when or how should or not an author include sex scenes in fiction. This was also after I'd listened to Plato, because the audiobook of Plato Symposium, which is like, no offense to anyone who happens to be gay, but it's like the gayest thing in the world. If you've never read it or listened to it, just get to Alcibiades' speech. It's hilarious. All right. Before I go on, I've got a couple more things to shill. My editing service, please check out the Wild Isle Style Guide over at wildislelit.com. If you have a manuscript that you like to polish up, or even if you're a new writer and you're really just practicing, it is a great way for you to learn all of the, let's say, technical skills that I had to, let's say, shill out $100,000 in grad school for. So you don't have to. It's way cheaper and quicker and easier and more fun to do it with me. So check that out at wildislelit.com. And while you're there, peruse my novel that's out now, Wand Smoke Broken. It's a weird fantasy fiction with an American twist. Kind of reads like a cross between fantasy, a Western, and a literary novel. I know that's weird. That's why you want to check it out. First chapter is free. You can listen to it or you can read it there, and it's available for sale on Amazon. Do I have anything else to show? I don't think so. All right, Nate. So let us get into the topic at hand, art versus escapism. I have a subtitle here, narratives as nourishment or decadence. Um, Now, that I think is really the heart of the question. But before I go on and on about my feelings and thoughts on it, I want you to define, or at least give me your definition of art, how you think of art. And then after that, go ahead and give me your definition of escapism. So, definition of art, definition of escapism.
All right, definition of art. Art is very broad, but it's the use of it using mediums to communicate fundamental human universals would probably be the broadest definition I can think of because like people like to argue what is and isn't art a lot, but I think that like but then there are people that say like the Campbell's soup can is art, but that's it's neither here nor there. Uh so and as for escapism, escapism is whenever you use art primarily as a means of communicating wish fulfillment versus actually tapping into any of the human universals, which I'll probably get into once we're through with each other's definitions of things.
Yeah, so I have a question about the escapism. So just to make sure I understand correctly, in these two definitions, escapism would be like a subset of art, right? So escapism would be a type of art. Is
Yeah,
that right?
I would still consider escapist creations to be art. However, I uh, I think that whenever we use escapism derogatorily, as you and I sometimes do, we're usually thinking of like art that does not, well, stuff that's created but doesn't really try to say anything, I guess.
Yeah, this is where the conversation gets squirrely because then we say, like, what do we mean by, we all turn into Kathy Newman right now. What do we mean
Yeah.
by say something, right? And that's a valid question though. Like, what do you mean? Say what does it mean for art to say a thing?
Uh, okay. So art, uh, almost all art says a thing to some degree. It's like you're creating something and it's communicating something that thematic usually or like a motif or something. It's but when you are creating something without presence of mind to say that you are saying something, usually it means you're creating escapism. So a big debate in internet circles sometimes is like, what's the word? All art is political. Well, I would say that all art has themes and such. It's just whether or not you use those themes to communicate an idea or whether you are just like throwing things at a wall that you think are interesting and entertaining.
Okay, so there's actually three ideas there that because when people say all art is political, that makes me think of propaganda, and I think we'll save that for a few seconds. We'll eventually have to get to it because I think, in a strange way, it's part of this conversation. And then we
Yeah.
have escapism, yeah, and then we have escapism that is, let's say, it's for the purpose of entertaining. It's for, and then that kind of begs the question, what does it mean to be entertained? And then what is this is a question I wanted to ask. It's in my notes, and seems to be the appropriate time. So, if escapism, we could say the telos or the purpose, the end of escapist art is to entertain, and we could say merely to entertain. It might do other things, but that is the true and core and essential function. If it doesn't do that, it fails to be escapism, right? So then the question is, what is the telos of art writ large that makes like art that does not fall into the subcategory escapism? What is its function? You mentioned earlier that it communicates a universal. Would we say that that is the telos? Like the telos of art is the communication of some type of, is it just universal blank? Is it human universal? What kind of, like, what do we mean?
Yeah, I mean, due to humans being the only creature we know of that can truly appreciate art in the way we think of it, I use human universals, but like hypothetical, other self aware life forms may appreciate different kinds of art. But for the sake of this conversation, there is, I forget who came up with it, but there's this anthropological concept of human universals, which are things that resonate with people regardless of cultural background. So to me, like art generally, at least good art, crosses cultural boundaries and communicates something that we all know to be true and interesting, I guess.
There's an interesting question that emerges. Is that true for escapism? Does escapism entertain at a universal level?
Actually, now that I'm thinking, sitting here thinking about it, I suppose it can on like generally a superficial level, kind of like it's the difference between let's look at antiquity for example. I think it's the difference between a good theatrical performance in ancient Rome versus blood sports. It's like gladiatorial blood sports is the escapism and power fantasy of ancient Rome versus like tragic theater, which I think is more artistic in nature.
I get what you're going for, but I have to disagree with the specific examples. I think if you got a bunch of men, you put them in a coliseum, like from any time and culture ever, and then you had people like cutting each other up and like basically doing the Roman equivalent of the a more exciting version and Roman equivalent of like the WWF or something, then like they're gonna start to get all pumped up. Um, Unless they're like really low testosterone, then maybe not. But um, I don't know if that counts as a human universal. I kind of think it does. But you picked up on the ticklishness of the question, right? Because there definitely
Yes.
is a lot of escapism, and you kind of you skirted around it. But would you say there is a lot of escapism that is not universal or would not apply universally?
Um, I would say that I don't know because like escapist art can still be universally appealing. It's just usually crassly appealing and not really like it doesn't activate the almonds, so to speak, I guess, which is internet speak for it doesn't stimulate greater emotion. It's usually just like junk food entertainment, I guess.
Yeah, and it so this is where I see like a little chink in the conversation. Like if I very much have on my Nietzschean hat, and instead of chink, I should say there is a weak point with which I could apply a hammer right now and
Yeah.
watch an idol come crumbling down. So it seems to me that some art also entertains, and some escapism does not serve the function of art, right? Because the function of art, as we've talked about, the telos of art, taps into some human universal, some I would say instinctive pattern that triggers some type of numinous experience in us. And I actually have, let's say, something in addition to add to it, but I won't go too far. But at the very least, art does that, right? It has that universal. It's why people from various cultures and times, assuming you render it into a language they can understand, can appreciate, let's say, the Shakespeare's plays, right? Because the characters are going through human universal struggles, like Othello. You think your wife is cheating on you. Like, there's probably never been a time at which an alpha male man who's definitely not not a cuckoo or let's say plagued by a cuckoo bird, if we want to say it politely, um, is going to accept and tolerate that. So like it's like 99 point. Well, I hope 99.99% of men or whoever have existed are going to uh, let's say be able to empathize with Othello very easily and like have to have let's say one of your high up someone like Iago who's like high up in the chain of command. He's supposed to be someone you can trust and you can't trust him, right? To stab you in the back. So you have betrayal. You've got something like Romeo and Juliet where it's the two they even say at the beginning, like the star-crossed lovers, like how many teenagers have been in that situation? Like it's inevitable that there's going to be someone that something or someone or something you desperately want, and you end up going on like a suicidal, let's say, what's the right word, path to obtain it to your demise, right? Like everyone has been through those moments of obsession that are almost best characterized through infatuation. And I could go on and on and on. I don't want to go on too long that way, but that is certainly art. But if I go to the bookstore and I pick up, let's say, a random thriller novel, um, it's going to have something that will entertain somebody else, not me. I rather find them rather boring. They don't provide that. They have a structure that mimics um, what you see in art, right? So they're going to have a narrative structure that's fundamental. It's kind of what we talked about. I believe I don't know our last conversation or the one before, but we definitely I think it was the first conversation about plot, right? We talked about that narrative structure and how you really can't subvert that for a story. However, that is not sufficient to make a thing art. Merely arranging a series of events into that structure does not art make. And you could make something that is exciting, but it's missing whatever it is that makes the art function in the way that you outlined, right? So it gives you a numinous experience universally. It doesn't matter who, what, when you are. It doesn't matter what you are, but it doesn't matter who or when you are. If you're a human being, and you can empathize and experience the emotions secondhand from the experience of this art. So what that says to me is that sometimes we have overlap. You can have art that functions as escapism, but escapism itself is not necessarily a subcategory of art. What do you think of all that? I know I rambled on for a long time.
Um, I could see where that could be the case. Uh, I was originally coming in here to be under the auspices that I was going to say that escapism is generally just like poorly constructed art, but I can see the possibility where like there can be um, examples of escapism that falls outside of what we could broadly consider art, I suppose.
Yeah, it might help if we start thinking about propaganda at this point, because having something else here, a third definition, will help us triangulate what we're talking about, I think. So when you hear the word propaganda, particularly in literature, but in general as well, what do you think? Like, how do you define something as propaganda?
Exists solely for the purpose of convincing you of an idea or to make you think that everybody is accepting of an idea. It can be one of those two things generally.
That
Because,
reminds
like,
me of,
Soviet propaganda wasn't to convince anybody of anything, it was to make people feel alone, especially towards the end of the Soviet Union.
yeah, so with propaganda, you are putting well, there's some similarity, right? You're putting a thought or feeling in someone's head. However, so the question is, how is that different from art? If I was gorgeous, maybe I might say, well, how is art not the same as propaganda? You're all just putting thoughts or feelings in people's heads and hearts, aren't we? Like, what's the difference?
Art is willing to ask a question, I think, and propaganda feeds you an answer to a question you never asked, perhaps.
And that, Nathan, you've stumbled upon my definition of art that makes it different from propaganda, that then makes it different from escapism. Um, so I might as well give it now that we're here in the conversation, and you interject when you feel you need, or tell me what you think. So I like to look at the root of words. So we look at it might be weird to say this, but I think the word artifice is probably more fundamental than the word art. I don't know etymologically if that's the case, but I think in terms of the meanings of the words, which means that art is something artificial. Now we think of that as bad in our modern parlance, but people did not always think that way, particularly when we lived a lot closer to nature and it was trying to kill us all the time. At that point, something that man built was like a kind of glory and something to celebrate. And you can see that even, if you read things written a couple hundred years ago, when they say artifice or artificial, they do not mean it in a negative way. They mean it in a positive way, in the same way we might use the word artistic today. Why am I bringing that up? Well, I think that part of art is the humanization of a thing. And I think that is the mechanism by which it taps into the human universal. So we are, let's say, if we're making something, right? So you have a human being and they're constructing a thing and they're composing, let's say, in the case of fiction, and they're composing that fiction in a human way, because there are certainly non-human ways that are unintelligible or inaffective, meaning like not emotionally activating towards humans. So when we're talking about literature, it's the, let's say, humanizing construction of a, let's say, in this case, written work in order to tap into those human universals. And then you've just mentioned before that art poses a question. And I think that is perhaps maybe more core to the telos of art. At least I think it is. And I didn't come up with this idea. I stole it from Jordan Peterson, but I think he's right. That if something is artistic, when the person is creating it, they don't know the answer to the question they're posing. And part of the function of that art is to discover an answer to a question that you can't currently answer. So in the course of a story, and I think I mentioned this in our conversation about plot, I don't know how the characters are going to resolve their conflicts. I just put them in the situation, and then from that position try and work out, well, how the hell would I get around this? And I think that would say genuine endeavor makes the art, right? And why would that be? Because I actually don't know the answer to the question I just posed myself. Why might it? I'll throw it to you first before I just sit here and jabber on. Why would it be that genuinely approaching a question and trying to come up with a real answer as opposed to a prepackaged answer? Why would that, let's say, function or facilitates the right word? Why would that facilitate the tapping into the human universals that art seems to do?
Because you're forced to grapple with it yourself if you're like not just repackaging a solution that you've heard elsewhere. If you're throwing in fiction, if you're throwing characters into a situation that you at first do not know the solution to, and then grapple with that solution yourself or discuss it with others while in the writing process, then you're more likely to come to an organic and meaningful resolution.
Haha, yeah, that makes perfect sense, right? So essentially, when it's a genuine question and you're arriving at a genuine answer, you're approaching the question like a human being approaches a problem in the real world, as opposed, and we could juxtapose this with propaganda, and then we could loop back around to escapism, I think. So as opposed to propaganda, and where propaganda you approach the problem from a very non-human perspective. Well, what is a non-human perspective? It's certainly an abstraction and like a pre-planned, pre-packaged conclusion, right? We'll use the word conclusion or end in place of an answer. It reminds me quite a lot of something like central planning, or if you ever read the Social Contract, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau lays out, his whole idea about how he's going to set up this like perfect government with the general will and the sovereign, or for that matter, Plato's Republic. Uh, you know, uh, any of these people who are trying to make something that is going to, let's say, get rid of all the messiness of human beings interacting with each other. That's what propaganda reminds me of. You're trying to put something out that strips is actually the reverse function, right? It strips a bit of the humanity away from the person who imbibes it. Am I getting a little too, I don't know, a little too woo or woo merchant speak with that one? What do you think?
Uh, No, I'm kind of I'm kind of understanding it. I'm looking at it from like it's a constructivist mindset. I was just for some reason my mind wandered off into a scene from Blood Meridian again, where I know that comes up a couple times on this show. But there's a scene in which they are passing through the ruins of an ancient Native American civilization that predates even the ones that they are like ransacking now, and they were discussing the different. Well, the judge was discussing the differences between a civilization that constructs in hide and bone, and then one that constructs in stone. And I'm thinking also of propaganda as the final stage of that evolution of civilizations, the attempt to reconstruct humanity or the human mind. But as of yet, it almost always fails because of the biological undercurrent of the human psyche, right? At least that's my thinking of it. It's like
Yeah.
propaganda is an attempt to civilize, quote unquote, human nature, but as of yet, always fails to some degree or another.
Yeah, it runs counter to nature. Now, what's interesting about that, so we could say uh, propaganda then is entirely in not entirely, but it functions to move us away from our nature, our biology. And by nature, I mean it. It's funny if you read Will to Power, and I think Twilight of the Idols, Nietzsche starts talking about like taking us back to nature, and then he specifically stops his conversation to say, "And not like that idiot Rousseau," and then he'll proceed to insult Rousseau for like 2 paragraph long sentences, um, and then go on with. Well, actually, no, he doesn't go on with his next point. Then it's the next aphorism. But that's what I think propaganda is stripping us away from our messy biology. Might it be the case that escapism is the reverse? That it might be an overindulgence in our base biology? Um, and that's kind of weird to say because that would put art somewhere between escapism and propaganda. I don't know if that's the right place to put it, but that thought popped in my head. What do you think of that idea that escapism?
No, that's excellent. I had never considered that before, but that makes a lot of sense because, like, if propaganda is like not forcing, trying to force an idea in your head, and escapism is vapid because of its lack of ideas, then art is in between because it is presenting you with ideas that you can explore rather than forcing or a lack thereof. And so, like, escapism can be is also useful in like the pacification of a populace, right? Whenever we were talking about my comparison of bread and circuses, I know gladiatorial combat was a bad example because like there is I guess some universal thing about that, but like propaganda and escapism can both serve authoritarian purposes in that case, I guess.
Yeah, it depends on whether the individuals are. I'm going to get very, I guess, Petersonian with this, but I read too much Yoon, and when you read too much Yoon, then like you can't escape and you fall into this pit and like you're stuck. But it depends on whether we're talking about the Dragon of Chaos or the Tyrannical King. So and that's really whether you're talking about tyranny versus nihilism. So the Dragon of Chaos is nihilism. It is the let's say the not dispassionate. That's not the right word. This is gonna take us in a loop here for a second, but I've been reading through Will to Power, which is the last of Nietzsche's books I hadn't read, and he talks about how nihilism comes about, and essentially nihilism comes about as a result of the pursuit of truth, and then we encounter our own grand insignificance from the perspective of the universe or from the perspective of God or whatever, doesn't matter. And when we discover that, we have to make a choice. And one of the choices that we can make is just to say, well, if from the perspective of the universe, my existence is insignificant, then, and I just accept that just on its face with no other thoughts. I terminate my thoughts there. The result is a kind of, well, I can't bear the suffering intrinsic to being. And so I need an opiate. And I think there's many opiates that we can choose. We see them all over the place today. Few people actually choose escapist literature because even that has too much of a hurdle to overcome. Now that we have, let's say, more immediate means, you can escape into video games, into television movies, pornography, all kinds of things. If you want to go into, if you're in West Virginia, heroin's rather popular escape method. Or I don't know how bad it is right over across the river in Ohio, where we're like neighbor states here. But yeah, so that's escapism. That's one answer. There's another answer that you could throw at the nihilism, which is to try and crush it into oblivion. So the nihilistic answer was the Dragon of Chaos, and the tyrannical king is the notion that one can, well, there's two different notions. They amount to the same thing in action. One is that you can construct a false god that's like an ideology, and the false god can give significance to man. and to the individual involved. Or one believes that if you get into old school Marx, like before he wrote the Communist Manifesto, he got this idea from Hegel, the idea that we are all collectively God if only we were to realize it and then we could wake ourselves up. But the problem with that is once you assume that, then you also assume a certain level of infallibility and correctness, and now you're in propaganda, right? So now we've moved away from the opiate that is escapism to the propaganda that is necessary in order to bring the collective into lockstep and to crush out any deviation, which is going to always happen in nature. And then we get the heartless, soulless, and in a sense, worse than useless propagandistic works, because not only do they not answer a question, right? Well, they provide a lie that puts you. I'm going to get kind of Taoist about it, but I've been reading a lot of Buddhism, and I just did a bunch of Taoism, so I can't help it. But what ends up happening is that puts you out of accord with the universe, right? You imagine, like, if the universe exists, it exists, so that's what we call objective. And then you start acting in a way that is out of accord with reality, you're going to start running into walls, right? Like, you're going to fall into a ditch. You're going to not end up at the locations that you want. And that brings us to ruin that way. So we have two. What's interesting about that, and I want to throw the question back to you because it's just jabbered on for I don't know how many minutes. So we have these two poles. We have escapism in the realm of chaos at the extreme, and then we have propaganda at the realm of tyranny, like tyrannical ideological stultification on the other extreme. And then we have art, the genuine answer to a genuine question. That would be like the hero who straddles the borders between order and chaos and explores the unknown. When we have that, let's say, what do I want to ask? I guess I'll just throw. I just laid that all out there. What do you think I did? What I laid out? I can't think of a coherent question at the moment.
I uh I'm also trying to digest this flood of thoughts, but I'm trying to find something that I fundamentally disagree with to keep the conversation going, but I don't know.
This is a problem with us having a lot of common, let's say, philosophical or
Yeah,
philosophic background, right? We'll
yeah,
we'll move the
we
conversation forward into somewhere where it's a little bit more interesting, productive, perhaps. So uh, we had mentioned before that sometimes art can also function as escapism. What do you think of the notion that actually the best art also functions as the best escapism? Like like the highest form of art would do both things at the same time.
I would say the most popular art certainly does. So there's an obvious reason that speculative fiction is typically popular, and the most popular speculative fiction tends to be something that somebody can imagine escaping into, but at the same time is like compelling. It asks big questions, but it's not something we escape into for want of an easier life, but a more interesting life typically. So the kinds of people that want to live in Middle Earth or whatever, for using a Tolkienian fantasy example, it's like living in such a world would not be easier, but it would be filled with meaning and purpose because there's an objective purpose to the world. There is a meaningful struggle between good and evil and such, right? So that in itself is like an escapist simplification of the world, but at the same time there's meaning in it, I guess.
Yeah, that brings to mind. I inevitably was going to have to bring this up. So um, that brings to mind the master-slave dialectic, because right after I asked you the question, it's popped into my head, and it's going to cause a problem. I had mentioned before, and I'll ask you this and see if it's the same with you. Do you find that you require your let's say, even something that you want to treat as escapism to be somewhat artistic in order for you to enjoy it.
Yeah, I generally do. So like, you know my tastes and my background and what books I like to read and what stuff I like to consume. It's like there is a degree of like escapism and power fantasy in it, but I also like there to be like other things going on and other themes, right? Uh and that's generally my preference. Uh I of course, like, we are both people who typically write fantasy and or science fiction sometimes in my case. And like, the idea is you're writing characters that you think are interesting or cool and put them in situations that are interesting and cool, but you're still trying to do so in a way that's like stimulating and compelling, right?
Yeah, that gets into borrowing a lot from Jordan today. So in Maps of Meaning, I think this actually comes really late in the book. He starts talking about the divine nature of interest, and this is something that gets like crushed out of us as children, and I hate it. I hate it so much that I get filled with this like spirit of vengeance, and I want to crack people in the head with this big like practice trainer sword, as opposed to the actual sword that's hanging right above it. Um,
In
th-
Minecraft.
but
Continue.
yeah, but so the divine nature of interest, what Peterson suggests actually is that what you're interested in is in keeping with your, let's say, nature as a human being. You could think of it as in keeping with your instincts. It's what you're interested in. If you it's the thing that your biology is geared to and wants to pursue to a point of excellence to become very, very good at. And when you do that, you can actually succeed in the world if you incorporate that interest properly. Because, and the reason why that's true is because of Pareto distributions, right? Once we start competing, you have to be in the like top 80th percentile. It's not good enough to be average. You have to be excellent. And if you're interested in a thing, it just makes it much easier to be excellent in that thing. And so I think the same thing comes to be with art, right? Again, I'm being a bit exploratory, so who knows where my thoughts are about to go. But I think a thing has to be of interest, a question has to be of interest to you for you to have the, let's say, initiative and capacity to answer it. Nietzsche thought this quite a lot. He brings this up all the time. It's interesting reading it as a modern person because I don't it took me a while to understand why he was saying it, but he continuously criticizes the idea of approaching all problems from a purely disinterested and objective perspective. And given that the scientific revolution was relatively recent during his time, I'm willing to bet that people were much, 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 much more interested in trying to be as dispassionate about answering questions as possible. And right away, I can see the problem. And the problem is that if you're legitimately disinterested with answering a question, are you going to be willing to go and answer that question when it's uncomfortable, when it hurts you emotionally, when you don't want to accept the answer? And I think the answer to that question is probably no, right? Like if you're not interested in genuinely answering that question, you're just going to terminate your thoughts prematurely in a place that's comfortable or in a place that's going to give you accolades or whatever. You'll have some other interests. But answering the question becomes a means to some other end rather than an end in and of itself. And I think that destroys the art. And I think that's why there are elements common to escapism in art that we both produce and that we enjoy, right? It's not that you include escapist elements. You include elements of interest because those elements are going to facilitate the answering of that genuine question. Does that hold water?
Yeah, I would say so. Um, uh, kind I don't know at what point it entered my head to comment this, but I just didn't want to interrupt you. Uh, but I was thinking about like the role of uh violence in art, and usually it's associated with escapist art. But then I'm thinking about Homer, the Iliad, the Odyssey, and stuff, but especially the Iliad, and just how much like we use violence in art as a medium to like usually to convey the conflict of ideas that we're exploring, and like I think that though that like heavy use of violent conflict is considered usually trashy in literature and that it's an escapist element, I think it is also a very useful abstraction for the debate of the question, I guess. I apologize for not knowing when that popped into my head during your previous points, and it feels like I'm kind of going off point now. But
No, no, no.
I
Let's
I
pursue
wanted
this
to,
because let's pursue
yeah,
this. So I don't know. My immediate thought is that sounds like the idea that violence is trashy to me sounds extremely effeminate. Uh,
yeah. I
um,
mean, I would argue that, but I'm also I'm just trying to play devil's advocate with the literary world, right? Where
well, look at the literary world. Who is it full of? It's we're not in ancient Greece, man. Like it's because if you look at in ancient Greece, how masculine were the orators and the storytellers? Like
okay,
extremely.
people might not know this, but Plato and Socrates were buff. Like this is not like everybody in ancient Greece worked out, and I think they were better for it. Everybody should hit the gym all the time.
Not only did they hit the gym, but like everyone went to war. Like Socrates went to war. Like he was a soldier. Um, I think even fucking Alcibiades went to war too. I'm pretty sure.
Alcibiades is like practically a swashbuckling like superhero of the ancient world. There's a lot of characters in like we think of in like ancient Greek, like the Bronze Age in general. People who you otherwise don't think of it, but they went on adventures and stuff. So I talked about like last episode I was on about one of my inspirations is one of I think it was Plato's students who wrote the Anabasis, which inspired the Warriors, because he was just this like young intellectual aristocrat who was like, I want to live a life that of note. And I'm not going to live a life of note sitting around, so I'm going to go off on a mercenary adventure in Persia. Like a lot of these people were like this. It's like the Greeks had like this weird thing where they had an ideal balance of like the martial and the intellectual being, where they would be both fit, competent warriors, but also like artists and philosophers. And these would all just be wrapped up into one person in a way that you just rarely see in any other civilization. But they had tons of people like this.
Yeah. So I mean, this is why Nietzsche. Sorry to keep bringing him up, but like it just that
No,
my
I love Nietzsche. It's
influences.
alright.
Yeah. Well, I hope that. Oh, I definitely know that not everybody who's listening loves Nietzsche. So I apologize for being like an agnostic hermeticist, which is basically what Nietzsche was. Um, now that I've read a ton of them and read some of the Hermetic literature as well. But yeah, so what the Greeks were doing was they were not stripping away parts of human nature, right? Like, and at their time, it was a little harder to strip away the reality that sometimes the answer is violence. Uh, and to be frank, like the answer a lot of the time is violence. So, um, here's an easy example for real life. So there's a local park sometimes I'll sit at, and sit there reading, but I'm not local to the neighborhood, and there are a few like Nimrod parents who are reasonably skeptical of like who I am. So if I'm sitting there and I have I don't know like a revolver strapped to my side, I can be relatively certain that if this person starts acting like an idiot that it's not going to escalate very far. And the reason why it's not going to escalate very far is I just pull my shirt back and then there's this like giant end frame Smith and Wesson revolver there, right? Like a Model 29. And it's just like at that point, the introduction of you could say the threat of violence, but in a sense, the reality of violence brings about peace and order and conversation, right? It just but
This-
people don't think about it that way, right? Like the other examples, like gorillas. So like gorillas don't fight very often, and the reason why gorillas don't fight very often is because if they did, they would wound each other really badly, and then the winner of the fight would get like murdered by some other gorilla. And so the reason why gorillas don't fight all the time is because they're hyper competent at violence, because they're freaking tanks. So what
yeah.
am I saying there? I think what I'm saying is that we have to, if we're willing to ask a genuine question, bring this back around to the definition of art, we would say that we have to be willing to accept an uncomfortable answer. And that uncomfortable answer is that sometimes violence is correct.
Yes, I would certainly agree with that, and I could probably like we could have probably made a whole episode out of the violence question. Uh, you should add it to the list. But but yeah,
Well, hey,
it's
let's
very
let's go. Go ahead.
go. No, you go ahead.
I was going to say, why don't we just go down that route, right? Because we can bounce this, we can bounce anything back and forth between art and escapism. So we just talked about how if you're pursuing art, like sometimes, perhaps a lot of the time, violence is going to be, particularly in literature, it's going to be part of a story because in reality, violence is part of reality that keeps, let's say, humans as social animals functioning in society, which is counterintuitive to the, let's say, soft modern folk who might be reading. What the hell is going on when it is um, in escapism, right? So let's strip it away from art. We're not talking about art that also functions in a similar way as escapism on top of itself. But in pure escapism, you mentioned that violence is rife. What the hell's going on there? What's the difference?
Typically, in purely escapist literature or any fiction, like comics, whatever, violence is not really a means to resolve a meaningful question. It's usually just like to to put the protagonist's power into frame, in a sense, I suppose. It's like most escapist fiction is like, at least in the modern day. Like, originally I was just gonna make fun of harem anime, but we'll go down this road. So like a lot of escapist fiction tends to be power fantasy in which you have a protagonist who is supposed to be an insert for the general like population who is expected to be reading it, and you display the person that they could be in those shoes with that power. So the violence that they engage in is usually just fighting somebody who is like obviously in the wrong and easily dispatched. And like there's no greater moral quandary associated.
Yeah, it has no greater meaning. It's power for the sake of power and nothing else. So it's divorced from the human universal answering that question, and that's a problem. I mean, we could bounce this back and forth with like sex as well, right? For like the harem anime. So, like, what were you going to say about that?
Yeah,
What
I
is?
forget what I was gonna say about that, but I came in here wanting to make fun of harem anime for some reason because art versus escapism, I think, because like generally, for the most part, like that is a form of exaggerated escapist fantasy about like wanting to be desired by many people regardless of your character, and usually the characters in those things are not people that would be considered highly desirable and unlikely to be in those situations, but still end up in those situations. But
Yeah, yeah. You know, that's actually that's a valid line, and it brings up another line, right? So, we'll use a harem anime just because it's an easy example. So, in a harem anime, not only is the protagonist not the kind of guy that all the women go for typically, right? Because if he was, then the desperate, let's say, narcotic addicted audience member would not be able to identify with the protagonist closely enough, and he would feel estranged from him. And he needs to be able to identify or project himself onto the protagonist. So it can't be the genuine guy who does have women throwing themselves at him all the time. It can't be that. So it can't be Conan, right? Because like then you
Yeah.
understand why the let's say
It's
primordial instinctive driven women are constantly literally like leaping up into the air so they can hang on his neck.
it's like the difference between like seeing the protagonist and being like, "Oh, he's just like me," and I wish I were in those situations versus, "Man, that guy's cool. I want to be like him." And to me, as far as escapism goes, the latter is superior. It's like you see this guy and suddenly you want to work out, you want to learn a language, you want to learn how to fight. That is to me the superior route to go with like escapist leaning fiction.
Yeah, so you present something that's something you can obtain, and that
Yeah.
if you so it's like a it's answering that question. Well, what's the question? How is it that you end up being the kind of guy that women throw themselves at? Well, like first of all, go to the gym, be courageous, do dangerous and rewarding things, like be master of yourself. Okay, so like that's it. But also the other line I mentioned, the other question is like, what kind of women are going to throw themselves at you in the harem anime? It's never anything like the actual kind of women that you have to look out for, right? Because the kind of women that will just throw themselves at you don't they're not typically the let's say honest and wholesome and loyal types of women that you would want them to be. Like they very well may be pretty enough, like that happens in real life, but they, you know, how many Amber Heards are you going to get if you're like you know, real life movie? Oh, that's a question, right? Like the
Yeah.
if this was art, the reality is like the man would be like very like super competent, probably super hardworking, very disciplined, have also probably lucky, and he'll have succeeded. And then instead of it being wish fulfillment that all these women are throwing themselves at you, it's like here is a potential vice that's going to destroy your life if you don't watch out,
Yeah,
because
social.
that's
You'll
what it's
get
like.
that's a good that's a good inversion of the harem anime. It's like replace the protagonist with somebody who actually is competent, and then replace all of the like all these attractive female archetypes of these nice and pleasant women to be around with like social climbers and manipulators and like people with fundamental problems of their own that aren't very appealing at all.
Are you hearing that, audience, my fellow authors? If you want to write a harem style novel, that's how you do it. And that would actually probably be really interesting to read, to be frank. Like, have you ever heard of any, like, we've had the stories of like the guy who gets betrayed by the manipulative woman and vice versa. We've had those kind of single stories, but I have never even heard of this kind of well, it's funny. It's really funny to say the literary, artistic, genuine version or inversion of like the harem anime. Have you?
No, I've never heard. I mean, the closest I can probably get is I'm hesitant to publicly recommend this author because like he writes like very sleazy characters. He will not be to everyone's taste, but he writes under the pseudonym Delicious Tacos. And I won't say the names of some of the book titles because they're kind of gross. But like he writes like these gross like lecherous characters and like he's probably the closest but he's not quite to the level of like a harem anime protagonist, but he's good with enough with women and stuff, but he also gets wrapped up in shenanigans with like the worst kind of people all the time. And he writes short stories about like this nameless character who some people assume is a self-insert, but it's probably not. I've heard him on podcasts. He's probably a better human being than the characters he writes. But
uh,
that author is probably the closest to get you can probably get. It's like it's an inverse Hollaback in a way. I don't know if people are familiar with Hollaback, but he's very popular in like the lonely dude subcultures, and usually he writes about like atomized men in society who are kind of like introverted and separate from society and all the weird modernity stuff. I think I don't know what country he's from. I think he's French, but his stuff is available in English. Um, so yeah, he writes the same kind of like stuff as Hollaback, but of the inverse type of character, an extrovert sleazebag.
All right, and that's Delicious Tacos, the pseudonym, right?
Yes, that's what he goes by. But take it like as I said, I cannot recommend this to most people. His stuff is very sleazy, offensive, and kind of gross. But if you're interested in that sort of thing, have at it.
Yeah. All right, so we've got maybe 10 minutes left. I want to talk about, let's say, works of fiction that when we were younger were treated as escapism, but that later on perhaps have become artistic. Like, not that they weren't artistic before, but let's say the as let's say you could use you and I as an example. So as our tastes became more refined, very much in the Nietzschean sense there, as we became more conscious and self-conscious of the world and obviously ourselves, and started to think more deeply, to learn more deeply, then sometimes you come back to something you enjoyed. Oftentimes you find it to be disappointing, but sometimes you find it to be way, way richer than you did the first, like when you were younger, because you just couldn't see all of the depth. Are there any works of literature that come to mind for you that are that way?
Nah, that's a good question. I mean, most of the
I'll
stuff that I had originally like thought might be not stuff that I had heard of in my youth. I had thought to myself was probably not very good and highly dismissive of it. But then upon a visiting in my adulthood, I've had more of the reverse experience where it's like I initially dismissed this thing and then I went back and I looked at this thing and I'm like, actually, this is way better than people give it credit for. But go ahead and give your example.
So I
I
want to
feel
use a
like
popular example first before I use any personal examples. So let's say in the realms of fantasy, like probably the most influential work of fantasy in the past couple or few at this point decades was probably the Harry Potter series. And I read those when I was in high school. Admittedly, that's kind of late to start. A lot of people started reading them when they were in elementary school, but they certainly served purely as entertainment value at the time for me. But looking back as an adult, particularly being a little bit more well read in Joseph Campbell and Yoon and Peterson and the likes, those people who see archetypal figures in literature, it's kind of undeniable whether it was a conscious decision or not on Rowling's part that the reason why Harry Potter resonated so deeply was because it just hit on archetype after archetype after archetype over and over and over again. It was written to be a universal, or not written to be. It ended up being a universal story, um, and I think that is something that for a lot of people, even to this day, as adults, probably they still only think of it as escapism. But I actually think that really, like that story, think of it what you want in terms of like what the whether it's highbrow in terms of the prose. I haven't read it in forever. The prose could be awful for all I know. I can't remember. But in terms of the content aspect of it, it certainly has a lot of depth and is something that you probably do want to give to your children to read growing up. That would be my popular example.
Yeah, I guess my most popular, well-known example is, of course, in high school I had read Tolkien and I liked it, but Tolkien, whenever I got into college and started really being interested in ancient history, antiquity, the Dark Ages, and stuff, generally pre-modern mindsets, it took me a while to come to the appreciation of just how an interesting mix of pre-modern thinking and like uh enlightened Christianity Middle Earth is kind of built upon, that fusion of ideas, because like it feels genuinely like I don't I think sometimes I think Tolkien is overrated, so I don't want to gas him up too much. But I think of but like going back and reappreciating him whenever I got older, it's interesting how he seems to masterfully capture the medieval Christian mindset while at the same time exploring what is essentially a pagan mythic world. It's an interesting fusion, crossroads of ideas, which of course he seems to have like he made a living, or like he made a living in linguistics and translating ancient like Iron Age literature and stuff, and he considers his translation of Beowulf to be like his peak achievement more so than his fantasy literature. Uh, but like, yeah, that would be my example, and I don't want to go too off into that, but
I do. I'm gonna jump off of that. And I know I talk about it a lot, but Robert E. Howard's Conan. If you want to, let's say, read someone who actually, I believe, did understand how ancient people thought, Robert E. Howard's Conan is really, really good. When you listen to essentially anything that's like pre-Socratic out of the Greeks, you'll get this feeling immediately like, oh, yeah, it's Conan. It's like how the people are in Conan. And you mentioned just a moment ago with Tolkien, this combination of kind of, let's say, Christian and pagan mindsets. And actually, Nietzsche brings this up, and Will to Power, he brings it up explicitly that it's an entirely different spirit, the Christian spirit and the pagan spirit. What do I mean by that, right? Because that's getting kind of I don't want to say the word esoteric, but I'm going to say it. And what I mean by that is that there's the idea of the, let's say, the I would say the ego and the consciousness as being the primary, right? So this is very like this is very Platonic, this idea, right? That's the chariot master who has the reins, who controls the horses. I think that the pagan spirit is not that. The pagan spirit assumes that the unconscious, the instinctive, the animalistic, the parts of us that are closest to nature are actually primary, and that the, let's say, uniquely human element, the ego, is secondary to that. And when you read Conan, it feels a little bit like, and some of the characters are genuinely a little bit flat, but when you really pay attention, you start to notice, wait a minute, if we are allowed to run our instincts to their course, right? If we don't exist in this kind of liberal society with all of this social training and constraints that really come from English culture, um, if you take that away, like just go over to Europe and people are a lot more like the pagans in a way that they're much more vulnerable to their passions, and then go out of Europe to somewhere that's not Christian, right? And see just how vulnerable to the passions people are, like a lot, to the point where like if you pull a giant population of people from those places and put them into like a modern Western liberal democracy, they have a hard time integrating because they can't control themselves because like rape becomes a problem, all kinds of things, right? Violent outbursts, machete fights in some places, right? Like, why is that? Well, because the reality is there is a kind of human universal in that pagan spirit that ties directly down to the emotions. That's why with like all the pagan mythologies we call them, but we could really call them pagan religions, treat each god as basically the personification of an emotion, right? So
I think
what go ahead, go ahead.
I was going to say this seems to this does resonate with the themes of most, like all of Robert E. Howard's work, in which one of his big things is savagery versus civilization, and how our savage nature is primary, and eventually all civilizations crumble and we revert to the mean, which is just our our barbarous nature. And on the topic of like it being like pagan versus the civilized Christian ideal, one of the most iconic scenes is symbolic of this in A Witch Shall Be Born, and this was also done in the film adaptation, in which the protagonist is crucified and pulls himself off the cross, which is representative of him rejecting the martyrdom for civilization that Christianity represents. But you could probably go deeper. One could probably go deeper into that, but I just wanted to make that illusion comparison, the symbolism of that.
Yeah, well, the way I want to tie that back in, because you mentioned barbarity, but remember how we talked about how in the modern literary circles, something like violence, you can well, I wish we could say sexuality, but sexuality is like celebrated because sex positive feminism integrated with intersectionality and then infected everything. That's a whole conversation of itself, but we don't have
I would
time to go
also
down.
argue. I would also argue real quick that our society isn't actually very pro sexuality because it is very infertile and sterile sexuality. But again, another conversation.
That I agree with that. That's I agree with that because let's say the gender ideologues ate sex positive feminism, like they devoured it, and now we've destroyed the concept of sex. So sexuality, what do you say, reproductive sexuality is now obliterated. We still have this weird hedonic, I don't know if hedonic's the right word, hedonistic impulse, and you can see if you go to grad school, like you will see it. You'll have some of your fellow students will get a master's degree writing microfiction pornography. Um, I'm not kidding. And they'll read it out loud during the graduation ceremony when we read all like snippets of all our work to like a group of people who are not prepared for it. And it is hilarious. That I want to set that aside for a second because I want to get back around to we mentioned sex and violence as being kind of lowbrow, trashy. That's you in the modern literary circles they consider it typical of commercial or escapist fiction. We talked about how in actuality that's wrong. The problem is that meaning was say stripped out of them, and part of what makes them important in terms of producing real art is the reality that sometimes the genuine answer to a genuine question involves violence or involves sexuality or some other, let's say, I don't want to use the word touchy, but potentially offensive subject matter. And you use the word barbarity. And I actually think that something that's important that perhaps is the reason why we have this wrong-headed division between art and escapism. I mean, what I mean by wrong-headed is that it's drawn on the wrong lines. I don't think I do think the difference is genuine, but I think the definitions, the borders of the definitions are muddled right now. And the reason I think that is because of the influence of a liberal thought that is born out of um, Christian universalism. Now, obviously, I get that from Nietzsche, but I think that, and Peterson to a large extent, Peterson views it as a positive, whereas Nietzsche definitely did not like it. But I think it's legitimate to say that the primacy of the ego, the primacy of the Platonic ideal embodied in Christianity, that birthed the Enlightenment ideals that gave rise to Western liberal democracies, that give us the cultures that we have. These cultures value things that are opposed to our natural, we could say, pagan instincts, and partly it denies parts of our nature. And I think the problem with that is that then what we do is instead of incorporating those properly into art, well, at least some of us anyway, instead of incorporating that properly into art, we we push it off, and it mostly just goes to escapism, and then the whole realm of those instincts become corrupted and perverted by let's say, are corrupted and perverted into lazily manufactured opiates. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I think that Uh, our we live in a cage of sorts that subverts our base natures, and then oftentimes, like, our opiates are fed back to us in the form of our repressed nature. And I could, uh, I kind of want to write an in-depth thing and come back with that at some point. But yeah, this is a thing that I'm very interested in. The idea of how much we sacrifice of our nature to maintain the abstractions that make up modern civilization. Um, and I
It's quite a
guess you
lot,
could,
man.
and the way that, like, so whenever I was talking about propaganda and escapism sometimes working in twain to suppress the masses, right? Like, the propaganda tells you what to think, while the escapist feeds the nature that it's trying to suppress, so that it doesn't result in, like, you lashing out from a lack of the thing, right? And it kind of plays into that. It's very interesting to
Yeah,
me,
we'll
anyway.
have to have a follow-up conversation once you've had some time to think about it. And I definitely have explored some thoughts, made some connections that I had not made before, uh, between art and its function and the way that it fulfills that function, its relationships, particularly, especially with escapism and propaganda being, let's say, perversions away from the Aristotelian golden mean. Uh, Definitely haven't thought that through before. I mean, this has been a really, really interesting conversation. We are short on time. Before we go, I just want to remind everyone out there you can participate in this podcast if you'd like to. I'd love to have more. I don't want to say guest co-host, guest. I don't know the word for it. But go ahead and check out wildowlet.com. You can find my contact form. Send me an email if you are interested. Just make sure to list how and how you know of me and whatnot, so you're not some random stranger trying to contact me out on the internet. If you have a topic you like to discuss, you can send that in the same way at wildowlet.com. While you're there, check out my editing service, the Wild Owl Style Guide. Let me help you the same way that I was helped through grad school, and you can develop a particular style of your own. You can embed deep thematic influences into your work and produce something that is art rather than mere escapism or, to be honest, I think worse, propaganda. I fucking hate propaganda. Also, while you're there, check out my book, Wand Smoke Broken, for all type of artistic, stylistic, literary examples and thematic depth. It is a work of art, if I do say so myself, but I will toot my own horn here. I'm actually very proud of that novel. I'm happily writing the sequel. I've got a slew of short stories that I should release as soon as I am less destitute, because right now I can barely feed myself, which is why you should go and check out my book at wildowlet.com. Nate, do you have anything you want to show?
No, but feed this man. He is working hard to make it as an artist in this cruel world.
Thank you, Nate. Yes. All right. Well, thank you guys for tuning in, and I will see you next time. Greetings, friends. Thank you for tuning in. If you're watching or listening between May 27th and June 26th of 2023, I have an important announcement. A Kickstarter campaign is currently underway to fund the covers for the upcoming Wand Smoke short story series, Tales from the Labyrinth. Please like, comment, and share this video or podcast to help spread the message as far as possible. And if you'd like to donate, click the Kickstarter link in the description to support the campaign. You'd be helping fund 5 book covers. That's 5 releases over the course of the year and 5 steps closer to bringing a dream into reality. Thank you so much, friends. I look forward to sharing these stories with you.